Welcome back, everybody. Today I'm going to be making some floating shelves. To start off this project, I decided to use some painter's tape to mark the locations that I wanted the shelves to sit. It really helped me to figure out exactly how long I wanted them to be and how many I wanted. After I knew how long I wanted the shelves to be, I just laid out the measurements and cut them on the miter saw. You should always use appropriate PPE when using equipment like this. Here I'm cutting the end off of this board so I have a nice straight cut to work with. Laying the first piece that I cut on top of the other pieces and using it to mark the proper length guarantees that they'll all be the same. This is the first time that I've ever used a table saw, and to be perfectly honest, I'm low-key terrified. I'm very grateful that a friend let me borrow his table saw, but this model is pretty infamous for having some stop issues. It uses a clamp in the front and the back to lock it into the guide rails, but there's a bit of play between the front and the back you can see, which means that the guide itself isn't always perfectly parallel with the blade. So what I've done here is I raised the blade up and I moved the stop all the way up to the blade so I knew that it would be parallel. Then I lock it into place and use a secondary extension rail system that allows for me to be able to move the stop back and forth and guarantee that it's parallel to the blade. The first thing that I want to do with this table saw is to remove this somewhat rounded edge of the 2x4 that I'm using to build my shelf. I watched a number of videos on table saw safety, and one of them mentioned that you should envision your cut. The idea is that regardless of the cut that you're making and how long it is or the size of the board, you'll know exactly where your hands are going to be for the duration of what you're doing, and you'll be able to make a plan to keep yourself safe. Standard practice is to set the blade height so that it is just taller than the piece that you're trying to cut. Here you can see that I did not reset my blade height after setting up my stop to make sure that it was parallel, and it's possible that it led to the problem that you'll see at the end of this cut. Table saws typically have a device that looks pretty similar to a shark fin that goes along the back edge of the blade and curves up. It's called a riving knife, and you can add some little claw attachments on it that will help to grip the piece and prevent it from shooting back towards you. And you'll see here right at the end of my cut, the excess just flies off. Now, I was standing clear of this kickback and it was such a small piece, but it definitely scared me. I really wasn't entirely sure why it happened. And the other reality is that even if I did have enough room for the riving knife, it was such a small piece that it probably wouldn't have helped. The intention of that first cut was to create a nice clean edge on the side of the board. And my plan was to do it to all of the pieces for the project, but I don't know. Now, even though I was fairly nervous about using the table saw to cut a little bit off of all of the remaining pieces, I absolutely have to cut this board in half because it's critical to the design. I wanted to be really careful in this step to try to make sure that I didn't get another kickback, but I failed. So yeah, after that, I was completely done with the table saw. I cleaned it up, put it away, and decided that to get a nice clean edge on these other boards, I would just use a block plane and a little bit of sanding. I'm pretty awful with a block plane, and sanding is boring, so we'll speed this up. After I felt I had some nice edges, I went ahead and gave all the pieces a good sanding. I would love to be able to say that this incredibly simple but also ingenious design idea for a no bracket floating shelf was mine, but I definitely can't. So I've got to give a shout out to the YouTube channel DIY Creators. And he actually has two methods for making floating shelves. This one doesn't require any bracket. It was pretty simple and straightforward, so I decided to use his design idea to build my shelves. You can check out the description box to find a link to his video where you'll get a little bit more of an in-depth guide on exactly how to build these. Now, the next step is probably the most important step in the entire process and where I made my biggest mistakes. The plan is to mark some holes and then drill so I can have a dowel inserted to keep these two pieces together. The smaller piece will get mounted directly to the wall with a handful of screws, and the dowels will be sticking out of it. The other shelf will slip right onto those dowels and they'll act as the actual shelf support. They won't be able to hold a ton of weight, but they're relatively small, and I was only planning on putting some small items to get them off my desk anyway. Measuring these holes out to a bit more precise and planned location would be a good idea. The one thing that I did was I made sure I knew where the stud locations were on my wall, and I didn't want to put a dowel there because that would mean that I wouldn't be able to put in a good mounting screw. The biggest problem, though, is what you're witnessing here. I'm using a hand drill, and I actually have the board sitting at an angle while I do it. All of this is bad. I really should have used a drill press, but I don't own one. A better method would be to have the board sitting straight up and down and work very, very hard at making sure that my drill went in perfectly straight. I thought I was doing a pretty good job, but I discover a little bit later that I absolutely did not. An additional mistake that I made was later I decided I didn't like the exact way certain boards looked and I wanted to change them around a little bit, and I kind of forgot what way they were supposed to be and how I drilled it, and it just ended up being a mess. Decide exactly which pieces you want to be matched up and which way you want them to be oriented. Put them together, mark where the holes go, and try to drill them as straight as possible. That's what you should be doing, not what I'm doing. The next step in the process is the finish. I decided to go with a fairly light stain because this is just a simple 2x4 and I wanted it to look a little bit nicer. After that, I'll be putting on a couple of coats of polyurethane. If you watch any guides on how to do stain properly, they'll point out if you're using a whitewood or a pine or something soft like a 2x4, you're going to want to use something called a pre-finish or a preconditioner, and that helps prevent from blotchiness that can appear. I definitely got some blotchiness, but it's not really all that bad. I also used a very light color stain, and I didn't use a lot of it. Probably the most important factor when doing these finishing coats is patience, which is not something that I'm very good at. So my finish turned out okay, but it could have been a lot better. I let the stain sit on the wood for a short amount of time, wiped off the excess, and then let it soak in and dry. Here, I'm just cleaning up and prepping the wood to make sure it's a nice clean surface before I start putting the polyurethane on. It's recommended that you take the polyurethane out of its starting container so that if you get any bits in it, it doesn't completely contaminate it. And then using nice, long, even strokes, I put on a fairly thin layer of the polyurethane. There's an appropriate method of how to do it, which is, I believe, to coat just the bottom first, and then after you've done all of the coats on the bottom, to flip it and start working on the other side with long drying times in between. I probably should have read about that first, but I just went for it. After allowing the polyurethane to dry overnight, I came back, did a light sanding, cleaned it up very well, and then put on a second coat. And here are the pieces after the finishing process. They look a lot better than just plain 2x4s with just a slight color and a nice little bit of shine. No reason to get fancy. I'll just use a screwdriver to check the depth of my holes and cut some dowels to the appropriate length. I measured and marked the dowel for the first cut. Then I set up a stop. Made the first cut, verified the length, and then cut them all. I did a test fit on all the holes to make sure that the dowels would fit. I want the shelf to potentially be removable, but I want it to be nice and secure at the same time. This hole was a little snug, so I'll modify one of the dowels to fit better. I believe this is referred to as the poor man's lathe. I chucked the dowel into my drill, and with a little bit of sandpaper, I removed some material to make sure that it fit. I think that I could have gotten away with just putting the dowels into the backer piece once it was on the wall and then sliding the front piece on, but I decided to glue them into place to make sure that everything was nice and secure. I used some wood glue in one of my previous videos, but I'm still pretty much a novice with this stuff, and I ended up making a pretty big mess. I was kind of rushing to get this project done at the end, and I was slightly concerned that my two shelves would end up being permanently glued together once I put them up on the wall. Well, apparently I forgot to get any footage of myself actually putting these shelves up, or maybe it was unusable. I don't remember. It's a pretty simple, straightforward process. You take the smaller piece and drill it into the wall. I think I used deck screws. Why not? I recessed the hole a little bit because I don't own a countersink, at least not yet. And then I made sure that I put them directly into the studs. Once they're on and you make sure that they're good and level, I went ahead and put the outer shelf piece on. It was a huge pain to slide these on because I didn't drill the dowel holes perfectly straight, and that meant that they were kind of pointing in every which direction, and it was almost impossible to get it on, but I made it work in the end. And there it is, nothing overly complicated or fancy. You could employ this same method with a different size or style of board to produce the same product and have it look quite a bit different. I just went ahead and went with 2x4s because I had them. 2x4 is just a couple of bucks. The dowel was $1 or $2 itself. So these shelves all together, under $5. Thanks for watching, everyone. Have a good one.